Well, Melissa, that's a very important question. I think we are all agreed on the simple premise that nations as well as regional communities operate on the basis of their interests, however defined. And in the case of the EU, which is the world's biggest economic bloc and the greatest trading marketplace in the world, for the EU, a stable global economy is in its interest. A stable financial system, prosperous neighbors, and a stable and predictable international trading regime, promoting democracy, good governance, and the rule of law. All these democratic values are obviously Europe's interests, some of which in Africa and the ACP we also share. How does the EU reconcile its actions to its principles? I think as an outsider looking at the EU, I think that the EU has done that to a reasonably good level. The EU has been the biggest single donor in the world. China is increasingly important in African development and international economic relations. But the reality is that the EU is the biggest partner to African countries, especially in the area of international development cooperation. That is a very important area. The EU is very active in the African security architecture, regional peace building and conflict prevention efforts. The EU often takes the lead as compared to other international development partners. So the EU is active in promoting and negotiating with us an international trading regime that conforms with WTO principles and that will ensure the long-term sustainable development of our countries. So by and large, I think the EU does do a good role in reconciling its interests to its actions. Of course, whether it does that, to the extent to which it does that, of course, is debatable. Well, to be honest with you, I think there has been some marked improvement. You know, Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, used to complain that whenever he needed to talk to someone on Europe, he didn't know who he should call. He used to say that. Should it be the president of the council? Should it be the president of the commission? He said he had absolutely no clue who he should call on. But with the institutional reforms in the EU, it's now very clear. There's more coherence. And Europe speaks increasingly with a coherent and a common voice in international affairs. And that is, of course, very welcome. We're also seeing greater coherence in the evolution as well as implementation of EU development policy, especially in the ACP countries. The European External Action Service is a very professional department of the EU. It's manned by very, very highly accomplished diplomats, headed by Nicholas Westcott, a man I greatly admire. Very professional, very capable, and also very, very sensitive. He can be very tough. He can be very firm. But then he has a disarming way of convincing you that you can at least appreciate where he's coming from. So we are seeing more coherent and more focused action on EU foreign policy and on EU development policy in general. Well, again, very, very important questions. I used to say that we're partners of destiny. We can't help but work together for the simple reason that we share a common neighborhood. The Romans used to see the Mediterranean not as a body of water separating one continent from the other. They used to call it Mare Nostrum, which simply meant our sea. And they saw it as an inland waterway separating one part of the Roman Empire from the other part of the Roman Empire. In those days, North Africa was the granary of the Roman Empire, long before the Arab invasion. The Arabs only came in the 10th century, came and conquered and took over. But long before then, it was by and large part of African civilization. And we had very strong relations with the Roman Empire, and after that with Europe. Now, those relations have gone through various stages, and where we are today is that we're in the 21st century, in an age of globalization, in an age of interdependence. We realize that on both sides we have to work closely together. We've succeeded quite remarkably in some areas. For example, without European support, and in particular the support of France, Mali would have remained in a difficult situation. The northern part was invaded and taken over by extremists who brought a very, very exclusionary type of politics, and they want to take the whole of Mali backwards. And thanks to France and to the resolute action by the European Union and the international community, working in tandem with the African Union, we were able to restore democracy and restore hope in Mali. We are seeing also EU action in the Sahel region, in Darfur, in Central Africa. All these things have, brought a lot of hope to the continent of Africa. And in the area of development, which I've already mentioned, Europe is still the biggest player in Africa. And through European generosity, Africans have a stronger feeling of hope about the future, that they can build democratic and prosperous societies, and that we can continue to trade with Europe and with the rest of the world for our mutual benefit and our mutual prosperity. So yes, in all these dimensions, the cooperation has worked quite well. There are areas in which it has not worked so well. For example, the EU is good on public-to-public cooperation, but not so strong in private sector. And we need to do more work on that in order to boost the private sector. As I go about in Europe, I talk to private business people, even European business people, and they express frustration that, they find it very difficult to find the finances and the resources and the support from EU to invest in Africa. The Chinese, each time they have a good bankable project, the Development Bank of China is right behind to provide the capital and provide the financing. It's much more difficult for Europeans to do business in Africa. And it's, of course, extremely difficult for Africans also to do business in Europe. So we need to do more work in facilitating and advancing the course of trade cooperation between our two nations, our two regions.